Thanks for having me here. I'm very excited about this talk. It is brand new. It's based on work I've been doing, and I guess that was one advantage I hadn't thought about when I left the PMI. Is I don't know that I really have time to write, but I've just decided I'm going to take the time. At the PMI, I was just pulled in so many different directions, and here I'm just have decided to kind of work on these things, and I'm working on two books. One is The Path to Effective Lean-Agile Teams, which is a lot of what I'm going to describe, but I'm not trying to sell the workshop. It's just the approach I'm taking. It can be applied anywhere, and all this information is actually free. I'll give you a link at the end. And I realized in the middle of the workshop what I needed to do was to teach people how to convey the information as well. So what started out as a how to run a team level, maybe one team or a few teams, turned into also an embedded coaching workshop, and then I decided to pull that out into a separate book, Being a Professional Coach. And the reason I did that is absolutely not affected by any method. That's just, you can apply what I tell you about being a professional coach to any method at all. So those books are available. You can see from these I've done in the past. I've got a technical background. Design Patterns Explained is a great book if you want to really understand why patterns work. It's old, but nobody's written another book quite like it. It's more about the thought process. But anyway, let's get going on this. Here's where I want to start, because this is going to talk a lot about some things that are kind of out of the box, not the conventional thinking. And it's easy when we're looking at agile teams and organizations that we appear to be in chaos. These are just a few of many I know you're familiar with: unclear requirements, too much work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We seem to be struggling, and we seem to be having difficulty getting our hands around it. And this has led a lot of people to say, well, we really can't figure this out. People talk about complexity. People can't get to root cause. We've got to run experiments to see what's going on. And I'm going to say up front, I don't agree with this. This is not true in my opinion. And I've got 2 decades of evidence to show it's not true. And I don't just mean me. I am not a magician. I do have a lot of experience. I do think I'm kind of smart, but I think it's once you understand what's going on, there is a lot more certainty we can bring. I say a lot of agile teams are like driving on the wrong side of the road backwards, complaining about how hard it is. So if they were driving on the correct side of the road, looking in the front and complaining and things would happen, I might have some more credibility to the complexity. Now, I'm not saying the world isn't complex. Of course it is. Of course we can't see everything, and I'm going to talk about complex systems. But I think we mostly do the wrong thing, and that's why we're having problems. And I think a lot of the reason we do the wrong thing is because people say it's too complex to figure out what the right thing is, and I don't agree with that, okay? So that being said, you really can't go too simple either. One of my favorite quotes is from H.L. Mencken: "For every complex human problem, there's a solution that is neat, simple, and wrong." So I'm not looking for that simple solution, okay? Because it gets easy to be seduced. But we hear Scrum is intentionally incomplete, but I tend to think that makes it simple. And I think SAFe tries to add everything that makes it complicated. There's another approach to take, and I'm going to talk a lot about it today. It has to do with what you look at and what you try to solve. And I think this quote by Covey is great: "How we see the problem is the problem." So if we think we can't solve it, or we think we're going to take something simple, that defines what we're trying to do, and it causes a lot of issues. So I'm going to want to start with how should we look at the problem, but I also want to look at this quote by Edgar Schein. This is really brilliant, and you should read this. I think we ought to have this tattooed on our face, because this has so much impact on what happens. We do not think and talk about what we see. We see what we are able to think and talk about. In other words, if you're not talking about something, it's not in your consciousness, it can be right in front of you and you won't notice it. This is the way the brain works. The brain has to filter out all sorts of stuff. It literally does not get to the brain or gets to our consciousness if it gets filtered out. We have these cognitive biases, or kind of an automatic heuristic we can't turn off. And if we're not talking about it, we won't even notice it. So this puts us in the situation of we're looking under the lamp post, what's been exposed to us. But there are all these other areas that we don't even see. The fact that we intentionally left it blank doesn't mean anything. I don't care if it's intentionally incomplete. We need to be intelligently incomplete. Obviously, we can't be complete. Yeah, it's too much. So we have to pay attention to what do we look at, how do we look at it, how do we expand what we look at, okay? So again, we've got to be this intelligently incomplete. How do we move forward? And instead of a collection of components that SAFe provides us, we want a system. We have to look at it more holistically and see how it is. Now, I'm not going to talk much about SAFe or Scrum, but I wanted to put the two common ways of looking at it because I'm going to present the third. And I want to start with a reflection. So this is from Peter Senge, The Fifth Discipline, which for me was one of the tougher books to read, but it was really, really useful. I read it a long time ago. Today's problem comes from yesterday's solutions. What he's saying is we start out, we make some success, make some progress, and then we kind of get seduced into thinking we have a solution. The Agile space has definitely done this. Scrum has not changed much in 27 years. And yet we're still dogmatically following it. Things that Mike Cohn said around 2002 to 2005 are still believed, even though there are better methods and better ideas. Somehow it just gets entrenched in our thought process. Our problems change. That's the other thing. Back in 20 years ago, we had early adopters and innovators, mostly on self-contained teams, coming up with what Agile is. That represents a tiny portion of what we have now. Now we have whole organizations with teams that are working across each other and all sorts of problems. We're not where we were 20 years ago. Yet the Manifesto for Agile Software Development, which was directed toward that, that's still kind of the guide for a lot of people, and the methods we're using are that way. So I think that's an issue. Also, this is kind of how I look at it. We're not trying to look for something else. We're trying to look at what we're looking at differently. So as Schopenhauer says, the task is not so much to see what no one has seen yet, but to think what nobody has thought yet about that what everybody sees. So how do we look at what's in front of us in a different way? That is the real question to me. Well, that brings up what do we want to look at? If we're not going to look at what we're looking at now, what do we want to look at? Do we look at the teams and kind of work our way up, which is a common way of scaling? Do we look at the whole and break it down? See, I think we have to look at value streams. And this is starting to become more apparent now. You have organizations like the Value Stream Management Consortium. Highly recommend them, by the way. They're really sharp. They're mostly tool vendors, and they're still mostly centered around tools and value stream management, but they got some really, really smart people, some really good things there. Highly recommend them as a resource. So I'm going to suggest we have to look at them. Well, then what are value streams, since not everybody's familiar with it? Value streams are basically the steps it takes from the concept of an idea until it gets consumed by the customer, whether that's an internal customer, external customer. It's the workflow. And value stream may be a bad metaphor now. It came out of manufacturing, and nowadays it could be more of a network, and I'll talk about that. But that's the value stream, the set of steps. That's what's important to look at. Now, I'm not redefining value streams, but I do want to look at a way of classifying them. There are lots of people who classify them in different ways. I think pretty much we all agree with what they are. SAFe has slightly redefined the value stream to making it a little ambiguous. Is it the workflow? Is it the people? They kind of fuzz that up. It's the workflow. It's not the people. People are in value streams. But it's really about the workflow itself. But to make things simpler, and to be candid, I came up with this classification because I have another talk, by the way, that's recorded, which is how to use value streams to talk to executives, how to teach executives about Agile with value streams. I forget the exact title. So I was thinking of it from a business perspective, and I would suggest it's best to classify 4 different kinds. There are the value streams the customer uses. In other words, how do they get the product? How do they use the product? How do they get support? Those would be actually 3 customer value streams. So that's one kind of value stream. Then there's the support and sales value streams. How do we support the product? How do we deploy it to them? How do we set it all up? Then there are operational value streams. I'm going to go through each of these a little bit more in detail, but giving you the overview. How do we, like HR and legal, they're inside our company. Or if we have to buy servers and set up servers, that's an operational value stream that enables things. And then, of course, there's the development value streams. And I'm going to say value stream networks because development definitely is not a linear process. So I just throw that word in, network, to remind us this is a metaphor. It's not really a stream. Now, I'm not saying there aren't any others, but this is a nice classification. It's what the customer's doing. It's how we're deploying and supporting and selling to the customer. It's anything internal. And then it's how we build all of these things. Okay? Yeah, and do feel free to ask questions. What I'll do if it's a question about how you do something in the future, I'll hold it to the end. But if you misunderstood something I said, definitely put it in there so I can reframe something. Or if you disagree. I mean, I really do like disagreement. That's where a lot of the learning takes place. So you will not offend me. I really do like to be challenged with things. Okay. So let's just go through these again. I think I've said it, but just to make sure I covered enough. The customer value stream is we're talking about a little more. This is where innovation. See, we can't control the customer value stream, but we will affect it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this more in just a minute after I go through all three. The customer value streams is actually how they use our product. So some of it is with our system, some of it's on their own. Okay? When you look at real innovation, like companies like Apple with the iPod, and they changed music. We get music in a different way now. I used to have to stick a CD in my player. Go far enough back, I had to put a tape in my tape recorder. So, but it's different now. That changed. So innovation is usually something that improves the customer value stream, or maybe lowers the cost, or improves the quality of something like that. So that's the customer value streams. Support and sales are equally important. I can't tell you how many products I no longer use because I had bad support. It was just like, I'm over it. I'm not going to use these guys. There's another company that gives me better support. So this is important stuff. This isn't the cost, although a lot of companies treat it that way. Then you have your operational value streams. I like what Stephen Denning talks about in The Age of Agile. He says your internal operational value streams need to support the people who are actually providing value to the customer. So how does HR work? How does legal work? These should be in support of creating value to the customer. They're not the separate silos as you often see. And then, of course, the development value streams, value stream networks, however you want to call it. This is how we build all these others. Okay? And there are usually lots and lots of these. And then you could talk about different kinds of these, but I'm not going to break it down. I think these four are nice classifications relating to the customer, relating to the people who are supporting the customer, internal, and how we build them all. It makes a nice, clean way without being too complicated, but not too collapsing at the same time. Okay. So I just want to illustrate a little bit this thing called what's called the customer journey, because this is the potential of a lot of opportunity. So let's say we have our system and the customer's operational value stream. I should probably take that word operational out, but because I just called it customer, but you get the sense. The customer's value stream interacts with our system. This is what's called the customer journey. Okay? Now we can affect the customer journey because they have to go through our system. And by changing and attending to the customer value stream we think would be useful for them, we could see, well, what would the customer journey look like? And from that, we could look at how do we build our system. See, most software is built from the system's point of view, and that's why it's hard to use, because then the customer has to learn how the developer was thinking. We need to flip it. The developer needs to learn how the customer is thinking, and then imagine what a better customer value stream would be, and then create a system that gives them a better customer journey. Now here's a simple example of this. It's a non-IT example, but it's brilliant. So that's a refrigerator. You're starting to see more and more of these. I've got one in my garage, as a matter of fact. Not this one, but something like it, where you have a door in a door. So if here they've got everything open, but normally what you do is that this door would be closed, and this door opens, and you can get drinks out of it without opening the rest of the refrigerator. It keeps all the cooling. What it also does by building it this way, they have a lot of places for drinks, which is actually kind of nice if you throw parties or you just want them available, or, however. Now, what's interesting is you use this refrigerator differently, both when you want to get something and how you stock it. So when I stock it this way. So they changed my operational value stream, my customer value stream when I stock it, and they also changed the way I unstock it or use it. This is very inventive. And it also has the side effect of not using as much power. This is very inventive to me. This is innovation. This is what we're talking about. Okay, so to understand how to do this, I'm going to have to give a little bit of theory. Okay, I've kind of tend to do too much theory sometimes and then get into practices, but I decided I'm going to do this here because I think it's important to counteract this notion that we really can't figure things out. Because I'm not unique. I know I have, and I know a lot of really smart people who also have. And I think it's more a question of what we're looking at. That's my point. We want to be looking at these things. So we want to look at what systems are. So it's a silly question in some sense, but I ask what makes this airplane fly, because it's actually a nonsensical question. The whole system flies. It's not the tail, it's not the body, it's not the wings, it's not the engines. Because if you add any one of those, if you locally, like let's say you make the engines twice as strong, you probably have an unstable aircraft and it might be too heavy. So it's how everything relates to each other. Russ Akoff talks about systems as being how the components relate to each other, not the components themselves. He talks about like if you take the best cars and the best parts of the best cars and put them together, you got a pile of junk. So it's how the systemness is how pieces are. Yeah. So this is key to understand systems and to understand complexity. Systems are about the relationships between their components, not the components themselves. Okay, what's complexity? Complexity, there are a lot of ways to talk about it. There's systems where the relationships can't be seen or understood. I mean, some can, most can maybe, but some can't be seen or understood. So you get weird things happening. There's also usually some level of tight coupling that causes a problem, okay? Understanding of the system often emerges as you work with it, or things happen to you cannot figure out. Sometimes you can't see what's going on. So complex systems are beyond figuring out. It's not just that you can't see cause and effect, but there's so many that you can't really understand. An example is the human body is a complex system. Think about how the heart, if you do something to the heart, that affects the lungs, which affects, say, the adrenal glands, which affects the heart. All these things are interacting with each other at such a level you can't understand it. But here's what's interesting. So Charles Perrow was the guy who, when 3 Mile Island almost melted down, they decided he's the guy who did the analysis. What happened? And he spent about a year or two analyzing it, and he got so fascinated with what happened at 3 Mile Island that he decided to study it more. And this is kind of an iconic, classic book about complex systems. Okay? And this is not a sense-making approach, actually. There are about a half a dozen. Kinevin in the Agile space has caught on for whatever reason, but Kinevin is one of like 6 or 7 major sense-making, like figuring where things are. But in normal accidents, what Perrow noticed, and you might notice nuclear plant up here, what he observed was that when you have something that's very complex and when coupling is very tight, you are really risking problems. What happened at 3 Mile Island was actually a small failure. A valve got stuck. But because of a variety of issues, they thought the water level was high when in fact the water level was low. And there are a variety of reasons why that happened I don't have time to go into. But what happened when one thing went wrong, then something else went wrong because it was tightly coupled. It's kind of like the Titanic. You'll actually find, if you study disasters and things, and another great book is a book called Meltdown, which actually quotes Perrow. That's how I found out about this book. Is what happens is one little thing happens, but it's coupled to something else, it's coupled to something else, and all the while you can't see what's going on. So what happens in complex systems is something small happens and it cascades into a big thing. This is called a non-linear event. We see these in IT all the time. Some slight misunderstanding between the product owner and the developer, and they build the wrong thing, it goes out into the field, and this little misunderstanding, we've got this big problem. I find this to be interesting because the biggest problem to me in software is due to these non-linear events, not due to complexity. We make mistakes all the time that just go out of proportion, and then they're coupled with each other so it cascades across. One person doesn't come in one day, and then they miss a meeting, and then something doesn't get discussed, and then somebody else isn't available, and what is a series of little things turns into months delayed. But see, here's what's interesting. Look here. R&D, this is the closest to what we do. Wait a moment, that doesn't seem so bad. We've got loose coupling. It's different nature. See, if you're on the Titanic and you hit the iceberg, it's too late to figure out that, oh my goodness, we have 3 bulkheads got slightly ruptured and the water's going to come over the barrier. You can't do anything about it. The Titanic is built. It's in the physical world. You can't go in there and fix it. At 3 Mile Island, when the valve sticks, but you can't see what's going on because you die instantly if you went into the reactor. In R&D, it's different. We have a chance to do something different. See, complexity obscures what's happening. We don't see what's happening. And things are coupled. But if we do our software properly, we can decouple things. And then the question is, how do we get visibility? And I'm going to suggest quick feedback does that. And this, in fact, a lot of the way I designed Amplio teams and my Agile at Scale approaches is how do you get quick feedback? Because if I have quick feedback, I can avoid these nonlinear events. And I will say a lot of times we're up here, we should be down here. In other words, if you look at how software development is done, we're very often coupled. We very often don't have visibility, especially waterfall. So if you do all your analysis, and then all your design, and then all your code, you don't have any idea where you are until you release it. Agile gives you visibility by quick feedback, a little bit, little bit, little bit, little bit. It's why even if you're working on a, let's say, only a month project, you want to build a thin slice, a thin slice, a thin slice on this. Okay. So Ellie Goldratt takes it another level. This book was written by him and his daughter. It's called The Choice. Everybody knows the goal. This book is just as good. It's different. It's a little harder to read because he makes you think more. Somebody made that comment. I said, yeah, I totally get what you're saying. The goal was a fun read. This is an interesting read. It's hard, but it's good. It's really good. I highly recommend it. So you got to remember, Goldratt is a physicist, or he was a physicist. He passed away a few years. This guy's not a dummy. And he says the first and most profound obstacle is that people believe reality is complex and therefore they are looking for sophisticated explanations for complicated solutions. Do you know understand how devastating this is? Now he knows the world's complex, but when you think about that, you get this idea that, you know, you're looking for too complicated things. So I just noticed doing a time check. I need to pick up the pace a little bit, but I've actually talked to some slides in advance, so I'm going to go a little faster, but I've really talked about this. I'm going to suggest linear relationships are still there, and in knowledge work, there's more waste by not attending to cause and effect. And we have to create visibility. We have to strive to keep things near completion so we can pivot, okay? And I'm making some assertions here, and you should look in your own experience to see if it's true. I'm suggesting there's a set of first principles we can use to see where we are and what we can do. Doesn't make things deterministic because we don't see all the relationships, but it lets us see what we can do to be in control. And when we do it, it makes the complex parts less complex. Okay? And we learn when complexity when it hits us, then we can learn to see what's going on. And we can correct. Okay? So this is what I'm going to call the first principles. This isn't the full set. I have got references to the books I'm pulling this from, and I'm going to add a bibliography. I'm going to send a PDF with more references so they can post that PDF with more references. But a lot of this is coming from the 2 books I'm writing. So here are a handful of first principles. Delays in the workflow cause additional work to be created. If you've ever written a bug and then tried to fix it 3 weeks later, you know it's a lot harder than if you tried to fix it the next day. That's kind of what I mean. Too much work in process causes delays that cause waste. So we got too much work, we're going to cause delays, that causes extra work. Handoffs cause loss of knowledge and information. People working on too many things cause delays. Components of systems interact, so improving one aspect may actually adversely affect the whole system. So these are 5 things I say is true. You should provide the evidence yourself from your past experience. If somebody disagrees, put it in the chat, but I suspect you'll actually agree with these. This is a funny statement. Self-organization, self-managing does not mean you can ignore these. I mean, they're still a reality. It's not about not doing things. The fact that you have a choice doesn't mean you can ignore first principles. Sometimes people take it that way. Oh, we can do what we want. We're self-organizing. That may be a bigger problem in the United States because we're a place of cowboys. But then again, I guess Australia is even worse, aren't you? Just kidding. But you know what I'm talking about, right? We're probably worse, just from our history. Again, people ignore reality. That causes problems. Okay, so what we need to do, obviously, keep our workload within capacity. See, what I'm doing is, I didn't just come up with Amplio Teams because, oh, this is cool, I'm going to make my own process. I'm looking at what problems do we need to solve, and then what is the solution to solving those problems. So we have to keep our workload within capacity. We have to recognize that communication is bad. I love this quote from Bernard Shaw. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. We don't communicate well. This is, by the way, inherent in human language. How people are organized has a lot to do with it. Do you have a cross-functional team or not? How do teams interact with each other? Are people stretched across teams? This is finally starting to get some really good publicity. You have books like Team Topologies, Dynamic Reteaming, a couple other books that are really good and talk about this. Okay, we have to have focus on what's the high value of work. Who are our stakeholders? What are they doing? Because we have limited capacity. Okay, now I don't have time to go over this in detail. So I'm about to show you something, a value stream impedance scorecard. But this is written up extremely well in the books. I'm just going to give you an idea of it. But I want you to think of this first, and you'll get the sense immediately. Think of a time you walked into an organization, and you said, wow, these guys are really amazing. I love to work here. They get a lot of stuff done. Now imagine a time you went into another organization. It's like, wow, how do these guys get anything done? And you may not be able to put your finger on it, but you have a sense of what's going on. This is what I call the value stream impedance scorecard. And I'm just going to throw these up here for you to look at. These are the 9 I use. I've studied this for years. I'm not saying these are exactly right. Why do I know that? Because every few months I slightly change them as it gets clear to me. But more or less, if you're not doing these things, you are not working efficiently in the value stream. If you got big items, if you don't manage your queues, if you're not getting quick feedback, this should be somewhat, you should have some sense this is right. Whether this is the right 9, I'm not that worried about. I mean, I'm worried about, but that's not the point I'm trying to get here. The point I'm trying to get here is there are some things you can look at that will help you. By looking at the value stream, it'll help you see if you can improve it or not, or how well it's doing, and that's the important thing. Okay, so how do we work at the team level? Now, I don't mean a team, because a lot of times things are built by more than one team, but I'm not going into product management, I'm not going into portfolio management, all that. I do have similar methods for that based on the same first principles, but this seminar was more about the team, how to build teams, things. Okay, so there are a few approaches. Should we say, hey, let's do these practices? No, because practices aren't universal. Do we have a set of principles and figure it out? No, that's too expensive. It's too abstract. You'll have a lot of reinvention. I don't like frameworks either because they're typically defined by practices. They may get you started, but then you get trapped because they have you look at things. Remember shine. We don't talk and think about what we see. We can only see what we think and talk about. Frameworks lock us into looking at it a certain way. It can be very dangerous. Now, there's an alternative to building your own or using set frameworks. Now, I'm going to make a claim here and I'm going to adjust it. Okay, so just ignore for a second companies that building hardware and software have out external regulation like FDA or insurance. Just forget those for a minute. I'll bring them in a second. But if you ignore those, what we found is there's actually a fairly strong commonality across them all. They have to figure out what's important. They have to have good team structures. They have to limit the work in process. When you have regulation in hardware, just add those constraints on top. So when you realize this, we're suggesting that these core things are actually similar. At Net Objectives, we noticed this after we worked with several companies. We said, these guys mostly have the same problems. They're in different situations. They don't have the same problems. They rather have to get to the same place. Where they are gives them differences in their problems, but what they have to accomplish is pretty much the same. So we didn't have a set way of doing it because where they were had to be accounted for to see what the path was to get them solving it. But the solutions were fairly similar, except add FDA regulation or things like that. So what we wanted was this idea of a framework that had the objectives, not the practices. What if you have a set of objectives, a framework of objectives, that each objective had different ways of doing it according to the specific needs of the organization. So in other words, we'll have planning, we'll have retros, we'll have things like that. Now I need to inject a new concept here, although it's not new, it's 4 or 5 decades old. But I don't know that everybody knows this, and it's what's called a pattern. So a pattern is a solution to a recurring problem in a context, as put forth by Chris Alexander in The Timeless Way of Building. Now, most everybody in the software world, for whatever reason, suggests reading a pattern language, but I highly recommend reading this one instead. He wrote 3 books as a trilogy, Pattern Language, Timeless Way of Building, and The Oregon Experiment. The Timeless Way of Building is the theory behind it all. A pattern language was when he actually created a pattern to build towns, and all the way from bedrooms to towns. And the Oregon Experiment is when they actually did a university in Oregon, built it his way. But in this case, he puts forward this notion of you've got a name, like planning. Okay, here's a pattern called planning. Why are we doing planning? So we know what we're going to do. What are different ways of planning? Well, you can have PI planning and SAFe. You can have sprint planning. You can have flow, or you can have no planning. Just pop things off. So a patterns framework, and this is one of the books I'm pulling this from. A patterns framework is this collection of patterns organized to create the system to accomplish the specific objective, in this case, having effective teams. Okay, Amplio Teams is such a framework. And what I'm suggesting is, I'm just saying you have to use our team. But if you learn it, you can use the concepts anywhere. That's really the intention. It's how I wrote it. Okay, it's agnostic, can be applied to any existing framework. In fact, years ago, I suggested something like this patterns framework by saying, think of Scrum as an example of how to do things, and then take every process or practice in Scrum as, well, here's how they did it, but here are other ways you could do it. Okay, so that's a little abstract, but the advantage here, we're going to lay it out. It's a collection of patterns. And this gives you an example. So here's the picture that I used to describe Amplio Teams. And it should look pretty familiar to Scrum, actually. It's just that I can substitute different things in there. You've got the customer journey, which I talked about. So we're saying that when you figure out what a customer needs, don't just get requirements from them. Look at the value stream you want to improve. Create a customer journey that would improve it. Build your system based on that. Have a business value backlog. Duh, I mean, that's a useful thing. Have a team planning method, a near-term backlog. This should look very much like Scrum. Actually does, doesn't it? The difference is that none of these are set. How you do these is up to you, as long as you meet the objective. Remember, I said each pattern, each one of these things is not a set practice, but is now a pattern that as long as you meet the objective, you can do it however you want to. So we don't have this problem of, I'm doing Scrum, but we don't do sprints anymore, because that's bad. There's a reason you do sprints. Sprints make things smaller. You have to fit them in the sprint. Sprints give you a cadence. Sprints give you a goal. But if you have a cadence, if you have ways to get things smaller, if you have a goal, then do that. It gives you the same objective in a different way. See, that would be a pattern called time boxing or flow, but with the cadence and the small size. Is that clear? I know I'm going fast. Nobody's writing questions, but if you have questions, please slow me down. Anyway, I will get through this in another few minutes, and then we'll definitely have time for questions. Now, this might look complicated because now you got to make all these decisions. And some people like Scrum because it's preset for you. Some people like SAFe because it's preset for you. If you're a coach, then part of your job has got to be, how do you get a simple start? So it doesn't have to be complicated if you have one person who helps the team figure out how do you want to start. So you can have some preset starts. The question is, how tough is this to be? And I suggest it's not tough at all. At the team level, you have two questions, really, two questions. Should I use time boxing or flow? Time boxing is good if you're building a new product. Flow's better if you're time boxing is good if you know the product you built and it's new. Flow might be better if you want to use an MVP. Time boxing is good if you don't have a lot of maintenance. Flow is better if you got little pieces coming in. So I'm not going to show it here, but in the book we actually describe some of the issues. Are cross-functional teams applicable? They're virtually always good if you can get them, but you can't always get them. So if you can't get them, what do you do? Or if you have to transition to them, what do you do? This helps you. You make those two decisions, and you could, if it's I'm going to use time boxing and I'm going to use cross-functional teams, it's going to look a lot like Scrum. If I can't use time boxing and I can't have cross-functional teams, it might look a lot like Kanban. I'm not choosing between Kanban and Scrum. I'm looking at the issues and then picking the practices that work. It's a bit different. How you start, you've got to improve. Inspect and adapt, while it's popular, is weak because it doesn't have a model of improvement. There are better alternatives. You can do plan, do, study, adjust. People misunderstand plan, do, study, adjust. I'm going to go through that a little bit. Or observe, orient, decide, and act, the OODA loop. I like both of these, but I'm switching over to the OODA loop. This was a recent decision after using plan, do, study, adjust since the 80s. I've decided OODA is actually more applicable, but both are great. You can also include double loop learning. I'm just going to give a minute each because I want to have some time for questions, but we are getting there. So people misunderstand plan, do, study, adjust a bit. And I should say adjust, actually, although action is fine here too. So you plan what you're going to do, and you look at your model of understanding. You do, and you reflect on your model of understanding. And then you study, and maybe things didn't work the way you thought they would because of complexity. So you adjust your understanding. See, like George Bach says, all models are wrong, some are useful. That doesn't mean you don't try to improve the models. It means you're always trying to improve what you understand. Okay? And then you correct the model and you replan based on this new knowledge. So your model, you've got this model, not just adjusting to what's happening. Now, OODA, and there's some great books. This is John Boyd. An interesting story is if you ever watch Top Gun and he applied the brakes and the jets would fly past him. Actually, that's what John Boyd did. He was called 42nd Boyd. He had a standing offer to fly anybody in simulated combat. He said he would always win in 40 seconds or less, and he always did. And that was his main technique. The idea was he would learn how to pivot faster than the pilot he was fighting against. And by correcting faster, he could basically win. Now, the thing about the OODA loop that's misunderstood, if you think you're in an airplane and it's just used for combat, there's not much checking time for your model. In other words, you observe, where am I? Orient, what can I do? Decide and I act. I'm not probably at the pace of a flight combat. Am I checking my model? There's this instant response based on what I know. But that's not the only way it's used. It can be I observe, I orient, I decide. In the orientation, I study things. How did this go? Did that work well? Do I have to do something different? So what's interesting to me about OODA and why I'm starting to put OODA in the book instead of PDSA. PDSA is great for a reflective time, but OODA can be used as an instant day-to-day, moment-to-moment reflection or it can be used on a weekly basis or whenever you do, where you kind of slow it down and think more about this orient part. So I like that it's the same technique, but you can adjust the time frame to it. And I think that gives it an edge over PDSA, although the two are kind of common there. Now, single and double loop learning. And this is one of the things that I find very amazing to me that's missing in Agile. Double loop learning is when you check your mental model. See, single loop learning is you decided some rules and you go in a loop. Scrum says, here are the values, here are the principles, follow them, and then you can improve on following the values of the principles. But you never question the values of the principles. In fact, it makes a point out of it saying they're immutable. In double loop learning, you're continuously checking your mental model and adjusting, why am I doing this? Is this the best way of doing this? Chris Argyris came up with this a long time ago, and that's kind of important. The DA philosophy is very similar to this. The difference between DA's choose your way of working and what I'm talking about here is I come a little bit more from what's the theory, and you can combine the principles, whereas choose your way of working is the same idea, but sometimes they'll have different life cycles and things like this. You got to remember, I was acquired by the PMI after they acquired DA. I can still remember when Scott Ambler and I spent the day at a conference talking all day, and some of it might have been they wanted to check out my temperament, but a lot of it was DA and Flex, which was the system I brought in compatible. They absolutely are. We come from a different angle. Thank you for asking that, David. It is very much the same as Discipline Agile's way of working. Okay, I think I just have a couple more slides, although a couple of them are kind of intense if I recollect. Oh, now this is something interesting. As I was doing the workshop, I kind of had never really looked at Nexus before, but for some reason, unrelated to anything else, because I don't really like the way Scrum of Scrums works and put things together, but I looked at Nexus and I thought, oh, this is interesting. I did something like this back in 2007, years before Nexus. Now, I'm not saying they copied me. I doubt they did. But I do know Sutherland knew what I did because I came in after he did. He started a bunch of, this was a company with about 300 people, but there was a group I was working with that was only about 40 or 50. And I came up with a way where these teams could coordinate. And you'll notice this looks exactly like the team one, except now I'm talking about teams instead of individuals here. And this works because the techniques and principles I'm talking about are what's called scale-free. They work at different scale. Yeah. And, yeah, Flex in that comment, the Discipline Agile Value Stream Consultant Workshop is PMI's Agile at Scale approach. So this is the same idea, except now we have teams, and it actually doesn't have to be just teams. It could also be Kanban in here, or different people are working together. And what I did is I solved this in 2007 with this group that they were doing Scrum effectively, but they couldn't integrate well. And there is a write-up. I'll add the write-up. There's actually a deep write-up on this. Plus, there's a chapter on BLAST in the thing, but I'll give you the case study. And what happened is after I was there, they figured out how to do Scrum better because I told them lean and value streams. So that's useful. Okay. Okay. So this is toward the last slide, and I know I'm a little over time, but I want to spend 5 minutes on this. We'll still have 5 questions, but if anybody's got questions you're going to ask me, put them in the chat so I can see this, okay? So when I was doing the course, the Amplify Teams course, and I hate to admit it, it's kind of I thought it was a finished course, but it turns out to be more of a beta as it's worked out. Because once we started into it, I realized these people need to know how to convey these ideas, not just understand them, because a lot of them were coaches themselves. So I integrated coaching philosophy about this, and I want to go through some real fast so you get the idea. And then I decided to pull it out into its own book. And what I mean by a professional coach, I mean much more assertive than somebody who just sits back, watches what's going on, and asks questions. You don't tell people what to do. That doesn't work. But you have to be a better understanding of what's happening and then learn how to interact with people. So these are just some chapters that are in this book. I'm going to give a few seconds on each, and then I think this is the last slide. So what's the difference between experts and those with less competence? See, if you're going to be coaching people, you have to understand that people aren't smart in general. They're smart in particular. I joke that only barbers, hairstylists, taxi drivers, and bartenders have a right to an opinion about everything. The rest of us have to know something about it, and none of us know everything about everything. Okay? So what I suggest is that really people who are good, they have distinctions. They see things that other people don't see, and they ignore things that other people pay attention to. You know, like a good downhill skier knows different kinds of snow, whereas to me it's either good for snowballs, it's slushy, or it's dry. That's it. To me, that's all I ever notice. The pickup sticks model of creation is think of what you're trying to teach as a set of pickup sticks. The top ones are easy, but you're trying to teach that bottom one. There is an order based on these distinctions. Okay, these, like I say, represent chapters. What do you say when somebody doesn't get it? See, I always ask myself, what would a motivated person who's smart, why would they not understand this? What are they looking at that they shouldn't be? What are they not looking at? See, as a coach, I have found you have to assume the person you're talking to is motivated and trying the best they can. Because the moment you don't hold that, you lose all power. I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying if you take the attitude that they're motivated and they don't understand it, and then you come from that, you'll be more effective. In other words, you take responsibility for talking to them, not blame, but you keep coming to look at how to do this. How to get management to listen to you. It's just a collection of these others. Think in terms of what they're interested in, and then how to get executives. So these are some of the chapters that are in the book, just to give you an example of that. Okay, so I'm going to stop. I'm going to leave this up here. This is how you can get a hold of me. These are the two books. They're up on the website. If you go to successengineering.works, you'll see, just go into resources for the books. Oops. Sorry. Accidentally clicked that, but I'll get that screen back up. Just go to the site, go to resources and books. You'll get the two books. Go to you can see workshops, and I teach the Discipline Agile Value Stream Consultant Workshop, which in my mind is obviously unbiased. I wrote it, but it's a really good Agile at Scale approach, and we actually have another class coming up in June. I also am very experienced with SAFe, so if you're trying to see how to do SAFe better, I don't tell people to get off it and all that. A lot of people have to stay on there. SAFe has a lot of good stuff. Everybody rants against it. SAFe has a decent start for a lot of companies. The problem is it truly isn't Agile. It doesn't truly keep you going. It's about managing dependencies instead of getting rid of them. But if you're in that situation, I've got some material on that. And I'll mention this Amplio community of practice. You can find out about that also on the website under the workshops. I think it's up there. If it's not, just send me an email. This is free. I admitted, admittedly, I'm a little frustrated with the industry because there's so many obvious things that nobody's paying attention to. So I decided every other Thursday, I'm going to not just have a talk like this. That's not the point of these. They're going to be more like micro workshops about something. These are some things I think people should know and learn. And sometimes there'll be lectures. Sometimes there'll be the use of Miro boards. Sometimes there'll be something else, might be coaching. But you can get there for free. And I'll make sure it's up on the website soon if it's not. I know it's on learn.successmentorsyou.com, but I'll get that up there. I'll put it in the PDF where it actually is when I send that. Okay, so questions. We've got 6 minutes left. Oh, cognitive bias, mental shortcuts, previous. Yeah, it's called arrogance as well. What I do, it's not just coupled with time pressures. You cannot get out of your biases. Acknowledging you have them doesn't stop their influence on you. I mean, I've tried. It doesn't work. What you have to do is put people around you who will call you on your biases. And then you have to learn to say thank you when they tell you you're wrong. And that's uncomfortable. So it's a lot easier to be arrogant than it is to be uncomfortable. And I think that is. It's these mental shortcuts. technically these things that I call cognitive bias are kind of heuristics, but they're heuristics you can't shut off. So you have to acknowledge that other people see things and they can see your biases better than you can see your biases. See, your biases show up as reality to you. Yeah, and then the time pressures means you don't stop and reflect. We have this nagging feeling about them a lot, but we don't pay attention to them a lot. I talk about that a little bit in the book, but that's something I'll be talking about in the sessions too. Any others? Just looking through the chat here. I thought I answered them as they went.
Yeah, Anthony, you have a question. Would you like to speak up? Please.
Oh.
Yeah, okay. So my question, I'll explain it a little bit because I studied a bit about Colonel John Boyd's stuff.
Oh, good.
So his work is quite some time ago now. It's absolutely brilliant. But
Absolutely.
His work led to the development of fourth generation fighter aircraft like the F-16. The next generation really just added stealth aircraft, radar stealth to the equation, but next-gen fighters are now based on the idea of a fully networked platform. So sense making is often done off-platform. Decision making is often done off-platform. So you've got a really wide variety of sources that are collected and prioritized in real time. If you point that model towards a human organisation of people working together, what do you think that means around models for the next generation of agility?
Well, I think you might be a little ahead of me in what you're asking, but let me tell you what I think the next generation of agility is, and this is in the recording I make of that executives and value stream management. I think right now what's in front of us is we have to shift from looking at hierarchies to rather value streams. This idea of top-down, bottom-up, things like that, is easier to control from a value stream management point of view. I'm not sure I'm answering your question because I think this is a near-term thing, but I will say this. A lot of the way we do Agile right now is we are trying to take different teams and coordinate them. And I think what you really want to do is see how they could start out aligned to begin with. See, this was what I actually did for some reason I'm having, there we go. In this thing where I worked with those people and came up with Blast is we had a value stream that came in, and these people didn't get their own stuff. Rather, they had a single backlog that they pulled from in concert, so they were already aligned. To me, there's this question of how do you coordinate, and I suspect you're asking a broader, deeper question, but to be candid, I just haven't thought about it. I'm just right now looking at the value stream management. But I think these mental models are important. Why don't you go ahead, Rachel?
So I can speak to that a little bit. I recently did a research paper on the OODA loop, actually, and my question will come after this. But I see a lot of it working in that we can react in real time and moving away from the examples of military, but looking at what happens in social media and the ability of organisations to react really quickly using the OODA loop framework. So it doesn't have to be in that context, but looking at, there's a lot of really cool examples online, like the Oreo blackout moment. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of that. That was a really cool one. I'd advise to look at that if you're looking at ways that organisations can respond using the OODA loop. But anyway, sorry, I'll get to my question, which is my organisation is really attached to PDSA. But what we do is we set up the PDSA 12 months in advance, and they're all set out, and then they work through them. But then I find we're always reacting to things that have already happened in the past. Do you have an example of how we could work OODA loop framework into the PDSA for companies that are slow to change, but so that we could have the ability to act more quickly on real life things that are happening now?
Yeah, I didn't have it here, but I'll find the slide and add it to the PDF. There is a way to think of PDSA as as an OODA loop, but it's just offset. In other words, remember, you have plan, a plan do. So in some sense, this is plan, this is do, this is study, and this is adjust. So maybe in your situation, what you want to do is see how they're similar. First, relate PDSA to the OODA loop. But then notice PDSA is very much used in this incremental, iterative way. And maybe you want to be able to respond faster. So don't try to substitute PDSA with OODA because you get resistance, it sounds like, from what you're saying. Show how they actually can be used the same way. Oh, OODA is just a different way of talking about PDSA. Then show the advantage that OODA can give you over PDSA by being faster and, in a sense, having a rheostat where I can either go at a slow pace or an instant pace. See, the nice thing about OODA is you can use it continuously when something goes wrong. You just aren't spending much time here. But every moment I can be saying, am I getting some result I didn't expect to get? You don't do that with PDSA. It's just not how it's usually done. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
In fact, it's interesting you asked this question because this was I decided to go from PDSA to OODA as the primary. But in my book, I'm going to be presenting them both. And that's actually how I'm going to be making the transition, is what I just described.
Okay. I look forward to reading it. Thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah, well, it's up there. 2/3 of each of those are done, and they're all free right now.
Awesome. Thank you.
And the answer to you, Anthony, is of course not.
Yep. I think this question will be the last one. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I hope this was good. If you have questions, shoot me an email. This was, like I said, this is the first time I presented this, so I had to go fast through a few things.
Al, my question was, given the pace of change that was imposed on the entire world by the pandemic, have we really learned the lessons yet?
The lessons of what? I don't know we've learned anything from the pandemic. I mean, you don't want to get me going on the American response to the pandemic. I think Trump killed hundreds of thousands of people personally. But
Wow. Yeah, that's probably true.
yeah. So I'm not encouraged by the rate of learning by humans in general. But what I am trying to do is, there are people, and I'm sure a lot of you are this way, if not all of you because you're here, is how can we learn better? And I believe that if we can really this was one of the reasons I created this Amplio Lean-Agile teams, the community of practice rather, is I believe that if we can get a small group, and by small I don't mean 5 or 10, I mean maybe several dozen or a few hundred, who start putting together and start doing critical thinking, we can change things. I really believe that. Margaret Mead, I think it was, who said, small groups can change things. There are a lot of really smart people out there. I mean, I like to think I've got some unique ideas and things like that, and I probably do. But I know a dozen other people who've come up with other methods that I can't say mine are better than them. They're really smart, and they're really doing things. What we need to do is create a community to have some impact. And it's easy to get distressed, and at least once a week I wake up distressed. I gotta say, I pet my cat more those days. And it's like, it just feels impossible. But then I say, well, but that's not what I'm up to. I could retire if I want to, but I don't want to retire because I think it's possible to change things. We're just not seeing it right now. In fact, I know it's discouraging. I'll say this one political thing and then we're late. When you look at Ukraine, you look at what happens at shooting yesterday in the United States, it looks really horrible. But there are a lot of people who think we're coming to a flip in the world. And I don't mean a flip where the bombs go off. I mean where it gets better. And it's easy to not believe that. But I think it's better to believe that, because then you're in more corrective action. See, I don't really believe things just because they're true. Now, this might sound weird. I believe a lot of things if the belief makes me a better, more effective person. And I gave you one example of that. I have talked to any number of people in the past that showed up as complete jerks and stronger words. And I've learned to not believe that. I've learned to believe they're a good human being who's being a jerk at the moment. And what I find is 80-90% of the time, that belief pays out and I can make a difference with them. And I know for a fact, if I didn't believe that, I'd lose 100% of the time. So it's not important whether it's true or not when I'm talking to somebody who's showing up as a jerk, whether they are or not. The question is, am I more effective? And I think this is a big coaching lesson for those of you who are coaches or consultants. The attitude you have to take is one of not looking for fault, and what is the belief you can have that makes you more effective in the interactions you have, and then take that on, because you have no idea what's really going on anyway, so you might as well take on the idea that works better. I'll give one other book recommendation here that's really had a huge impact on me, and that is The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. There are only 2 books that are in my top 5 personal and top 5 professional. Timeless Way of Building, I already mentioned that, is one of them, and Ryan Holiday's The Obstacle is the Way. It's really a book about stoicism, because it starts letting you really see 2 things. One is I can only control my own thoughts. I can't control anybody else's. And the second thing is what seems to be the problem. I'm not saying they're not Pollyanna. They don't say, oh, there's an opportunity and problems. He's not like that when he says the obstacle is the way. But if you look at that problem, if you take that problem on, that will give you the insights to go past it. And that's an important lesson.